Chapter 6 focuses on experience and learning. And the experience and learning falls under that constructivist learning theory that we talked about way back in Chapter 2. The idea that the learner is constructing their learning and building upon experiences that they have. And in fact, right in the beginning on page 104, your authors state this: at the heart of adult learning is engaging in, reflecting upon, and making meaning of our experiences, whether these experiences are primarily physical, emotional, cognitive, social, or spiritual. We're going to make meaning out of various things that we have learned in those domains. And in fact, several authors note that there are 3 domains for learning. The first one being psychomotor, which would be physical. The second one being the affective domain, which would be the emotional, social, and spiritual. And the last one being the cognitive domain. And this author just mentioned that it's cognitive, or the thinking domain. So those 3 domains for learning are really about the adult learner's experience. Arguably, if you have adolescents that you're working with and they have experiences, I think this also apply. It's when we get down to novice learners and and I'm talking about very young children who don't have quite as much experience, that we have to build and kind of scaffold their learning, which is also talked about in this chapter, scaffolding the learner. All right. So in this chapter then, contextual learning, they discuss the idea that experience within context is central to understanding, that if we have it within some context and that it's not completely abstract, we can connect it to something, we make meaning out of it, then we can retain it, we can transfer it, we can create new knowledge. Contextual learning is learning that occurs in close relationships with actual experiences. So that experience may be hands-on, it may be auditory, it may be something we taste. I think a lot of us, we hear a song and we immediately are taken back to a particular situation, that experience that we have. It doesn't have to always be a hands-on experience. Sometimes those of you who work in CTE, we're like, we're going to do something hands-on. And I know that when I'm getting ready to do a couple of workshops in the next week, it's like, okay, how much stuff can I pack? How much stuff can I bring? You know, can I do a demonstration from this podium as a keynote speaker? I'm always looking for that kind of physical hands-on kind of thing, because that really resonates with me and a way for me to show something. Terms such as experiential learning, real-world education, active learning, learning-centered instruction convey a similar approach. And in fact, your chapter discusses a few more of these types of learning models, if you will, and you may have heard of, what's the other one I heard of the other, well, it was a while ago, but you know, active brain learning. There's all these different folks who've put together models based on experiential learning and have proposed that this is a good way or a good model to use for training individuals. Now remember, there's a little bit of a difference between training and learning. So this triangle is Bloom's taxonomy for learning. And it was revised a few years ago, and they didn't add any more, but just changed some of the terminology. I think one was synthesis instead of evaluation, analyzing came down here. But this idea that remembering here on the bottom, that's recall, relevant knowledge. That's one type of domain. It's part of our long-term memory. It's that collection of facts that we have, the stuff that's crystallized inside of our mind, remembering a particular temperature that we're supposed to cook something. Those facts that help us through and guide are the guiding principles for the next level here, which is understanding, making sense of some material that we have learned. And then moving on up into the application of what we've learned. So I can remember something, I understand it because it makes sense to me in some way. I can apply it in some sort of context, and this is really the contextual learning piece. This is the part that when you're looking at experience and contextual learning, we're really looking at the application phase. And this is why career and technical education in particular, those of you who've read John Dewey, and I would say are Deweyites, understand that this is this part of this domain here for understanding and learning is the application, being able to transfer it to different settings or situations. Analyzing then, breaking up those concepts into small parts to see how each part is related to one another. That's a way to kind of like, it's almost a synthesis, if you will. If we can analyze it and break it down into some parts, and sometimes things have to be broken down that we apply because they're going to be put into different types of contexts. Evaluation then, or evaluating, making judgments based on a set of guidelines. So now we are going to take a particular area of knowledge or concept, and we've gone through, we understand it, we can communicate about it, we can apply it in some real world way, we can break it down, and we're going to evaluate good, bad, and different, make some decisions that way. Evaluation is all about making a decision. And then creating, putting information together in an innovative way that we then create some new knowledge based on these other factors that we have understood. So in constructivism and in experiential learning, we're really looking at this application phase. In fact, some authors would suggest we start here. This is the beginning. We start with saying, hey, we have a problem. And how are we going to solve that problem? We're going to need to apply something to that problem. We're going to have to understand some concepts, and it means we're going to need to remember some facts. So oftentimes when you see like backward design approaches to learning, you take the situation of the problem and you construct it, and you start with the application and work backwards to get to the rest of this content. Now, it doesn't mean that because this up here, it's not like Maslow's hierarchy of needs where self-actualization, this is, better than anything else. It just means that these are the different domains of learning. And sometimes we need to be in this domain and sometimes in this domain. But truthfully, it's hard for adults to, and even adolescents to say, why am I learning this if they don't see this part, the applying part? And later becomes the analyzing and breaking it apart to create some sort of new knowledge. So Bloom's domains actually have withstood this test of time from the 50s. They've been modified slightly, but they really make a lot of sense, especially for constructivism and experience and learning. There is a relationship, obviously, between experience and learning. I think all of us can probably point to good examples, and text gives some great examples. But here are some models for experiential learning that they discuss. Kolb's learning cycle and resulting learning styles. Now, in this chapter, and it's on page 109, they discuss this as a learning cycle. I'm not sure I agree with the cycle. Cycle usually means that, of course, it doesn't end. But I also don't see that usually there's a progression in that you have to go through one to get to the other. So if I start with active experimentation, I'm trying to fix something in my garage or I'm out in my yard trying to solve a problem, some sort of design issue, I have some experimentation I'm working on, and then I'm having some sort of concrete experience with that, and then I'm going to reflect on that, do some reflective thinking, make some changes maybe, and then I have some abstract thought. And now I'm making an assumption that it goes this way. I'm not really sure that this is a cycle. It may be elements of learning called, it might be a more like a model for how we learn, maybe an active experimentation, or we have abstract conceptualizations or concrete experiences, and we do reflective observation. But I would argue that sometimes we're doing active experimentation and we're going over here. Maybe that's why there's a line, but there's no arrows to reflective observation, or maybe we're here having a concrete experience and then we need to take it to the abstract. I really couldn't understand this as a cycle. And in fact, there are quite a few critics of Kolb's learning cycle. He's a psychologist and developed this and now works in the training arena. And again, sometimes when you look at some of these, and by the way, I think that when I Googled this and was looking up learning styles, yep, here we are on Wikipedia, and it talks about all the different learning styles related to these models. We'll talk about that in just a minute. They found 71 different models that folks are using. Oftentimes in a training program, use my program, it's the best one, your employees will understand it, so on and so forth. But for me, these might be places I go through in terms of learning, but I don't see it as a cycle, and I really don't see it as anything prescriptive. At the end of your chapter, however, they put forth this diagram, which is some strategies for working in these particular parts of the cycle: concrete experience, recall the past, role playing, case studies, so on and so forth. But as you look here, you'll see a lot of overlap. Sometimes again down here you'll see role play in this one and role play in this one, or journaling in this one and journaling in another one up here. I think that these are good tools for strategies and differentiation, but I don't necessarily agree that they'd always fit under one category or another. Reflective observation in particular, these are all really good strategies, but I might be able to use them with some active experimentation, or I might be able to use them with some abstract, for example, assess participants, let's see, Socratic dialogue. I might be able to use Socratic dialogue to get at abstract concepts. So those are awesome strategies. I'm just not so sure that they belong in these particular levels or stages, if you will, of that cycle. And I'm not sure it's a cycle. Tennant and Pogson are talked about in that chapter. They have 4 levels or ways that experience can be incorporated into instruction. These actually resonated with me, and they give a good example of a person running for office using their prior experience, a person who's engaged in a current experience running for office, and how they have to engage in some self-directed learning to get through that and learn more in that current situation or current experience. They talk about how you would do it as not a novice learner, but how you would take your knowledge that you have right now and have a new experience. And finally, the learning from experience, which I think all of us can relate to, especially as we get older and we have more experiences, the more that we can reflect upon, make some analysis, make some decisions, and so forth. So there's a couple of them that are discussed right there, and then Fenwick and some others are talked about. And as I mentioned, 71 of them are noted inside of the Wikipedia, and they're all documented and listed. And yeah, some of them have some very dubious research behind them, and some of them have no research at all, and some of them will link it to constructivism and works just fine. But oftentimes when you go and look at these in their .com websites, there are ways that people they've created this model based on something that's concrete, like experiential learning, and parlayed that into a business enterprise. So that's some of the things that I noticed by looking at some of those styles. At present, there is no adequate evidence to justify incorporating learning styles assessment into general educational practice. Now, this video here, we'll come back to this quote. This video here by Daniel Willingham, some of you maybe have watched this previously, but I do want to have, if you haven't watched this video, watch it now. If you have, fast forward to my comments. I do want to make a couple comments about what some of the things he says on the back side of this.
Hi, my name is Dan Willingham. I'm a cognitive psychologist and a neuroscientist. I'm also a professor at the University of Virginia. I'm going to talk to you today about learning styles and how cognitive psychologists know that they don't exist. Now, the basic idea of learning styles seems to make a lot of sense. The idea is that different people have different ways of learning. So if you can teach in a way that's consistent with a student's style, he or she should learn better.
There have been lots of these proposals over the years, like verbalizers versus visualizers, or analytic versus non-analytic thinkers. I'm going to talk about what is the best known, visual versus auditory versus kinesthetic learners, but what I'm going to say about this theory really goes for all the others too. So what are learning style theories? The idea is that the way that information is organized, or the way that you think about it, matters in how easily you understand or learn it. Suppose you're building a new house and you're trying to give your friend a sense of what it will be like. The visual learner will understand best by seeing the plans, the auditory learner by listening to a description of the house, and kinesthetic learners need to move, so your kinesthetic friend might build a model. The theory says that anyone can learn in any of the 3 ways, so the mostly visual person can still learn auditorily or kinesthetically, and likewise for the mostly kinesthetic person. But the brain doesn't work that way. It is true that you can store memories in any of those 3 formats. Suppose I ask you, what's the shape of a German Shepherd's ears? Most people say that they look at a visual mental image when they answer that question, and there is good evidence that you do indeed store that information visually. Or if I ask, who has a deeper voice, your best friend or your boss? You'll sort of listen in your mind's ear, and those sounds are stored auditorily. Kinesthesia is a little trickier, but it works the same way. Movements that you know really well, like riding a bicycle or tying shoelaces, will be stored kinesthetically. And yes, it's probably true that some people have clear, vivid images and some have weak, undetailed images. Almost any characteristic of people is going to vary, whether it's height or weight or visual memory. So in that sense, some people are good visual thinkers. Okay, so that's the scientific background, and it sort of sounds like the theory is right? Let me tell you what's wrong. Think about what the theory ought to predict. Here's a visual learner, and here's an auditory learner. Suppose I give each of them 2 lists of words to learn. For one list, I read it aloud, auditory presentation, and for another list, I show a series of slides, a visual presentation. Later, everybody gets a test. The prediction is straightforward. The visual learner should learn the slides better than the words, and the auditory learner should learn the words better than the slides. Lots of people have done that experiment, and that's not the result you get. The thing is, you don't learn the words visually or auditorily. Actually, an auditory test would be about what the particular sound of the voice was, the auditory quality. For example, did you hear shell or shell? And a visual test would be for the particular visual qualities of the slides, what they actually look like. When you just ask people to remember the words, you're really asking them to remember meaning, not sound or visual information. And in fact, most of what teachers want students to learn is not visual or auditory or kinesthetic information. It's meaning-based. For example, you know what the word opera means. For you, that's a meaning-based representation. And the meaning is independent of whether you learn the meaning by first seeing an opera or hearing an aria. Most of what's in your head, especially what you learned at school, is meaning-based. So you might think, okay, but the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic idea is still right some of the time, like when teachers want students to learn things that are not meaning-based. It's true, sometimes students might learn things that are essentially visual, like the shapes of countries on a map, or something that's essentially auditory, like a correct French accent. But notice what the theory's prediction would be. The prediction of the theory is not simply people with good auditory memory will be better at learning auditory stuff than people with average auditory memory. No one would argue with that. The prediction is that an auditory learner is always going to learn better if you present things auditorily, because that's supposed to be his or her best modality. Well, that's pretty obviously silly. You're not going to try to come up with an auditory presentation of the shape of Algeria. Everybody needs to see it.
Okay, so let me summarize what I've said so far. It's true that some people have a better visual memory than other people, and other people are better at learning auditory material than other people are. But that fact isn't really all that important for teachers, because most of what teachers want students to learn is not particularly visual or auditory or kinesthetic. Most of what teachers want students to learn is based on meaning. The second point concerns the particular prediction of the theory. The important prediction of the theory is not that some people have better visual memory than other people. The prediction is that those people with a good visual memory will always learn better if you present things visually. But that idea is clearly wrong. When you've got something that you want students to learn that's especially visual, like the shape of a country on a map, everybody needs to see a visual presentation, not just those people who have really good visual memory. Okay, so if the theory is wrong, as I'm claiming, why does it seem so right?
One reason is that everyone believes it, not just teachers. The theory is accepted by about 90% of the students at the University of Virginia. Second reason people believe it is that something close to the theory is right. People can learn in different ways, and some people are especially good at learning certain types of information. But the specific predictions of the theory and the way that you would apply it in the classroom are wrong. A third reason this theory seems right is that if you already believe it, you'll probably interpret ambiguous situations as consistent with the theory. For example, suppose you're talking to a student about the structure of the atom, but it's not really clicking. Finally, you say, picture the solar system. The nucleus of an atom is like the sun, and the electrons are like the planets spinning around it. The student understands, and you think, aha, he must be a visual learner. But maybe that was just a good analogy that would have helped any student. Or maybe the student needed just one more example for the idea to click. Why the student understood at that point is actually ambiguous. But if you already believe the theory, you're likely to interpret what happened as being consistent with the theory. Remember, there are many theories about learning styles. Visual, auditory, and kinesthetic is just one. But what I've said about that theory goes for the others too.
Good teaching is good teaching, and teachers don't need to adjust their teaching to individual students' learning styles.
Okay, so at present there's no adequate evidence base to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general education practice. Thus, limited education resources would be better devoted to adopting other educational practices that have strong evidence base, of which there are increasing number. In other words, there's lots of other ways to get increased understanding or increased academic achievement. So he actually put out a second video to answer a couple of questions, because some folks said then, well, if learning styles don't exist, what is good teaching? So watch this one for just a moment.
Hey, I want to clarify one point about this video. In the closing, I said good teaching is good teaching and teachers don't need to worry about learning styles or something close to that. A lot of people have said, so does this mean that you think that students are interchangeable, classes are interchangeable? The answer to that is of course not, and it's sort of obvious that teachers do differentiate instruction and should, based on things like students' motivation, students' personality, students' interests, and so on. And that makes sense, and I wouldn't want a child of mine in a classroom where a teacher didn't at least try to do that. But learning style theories are not theories of personality and motivation or interest. Learning style theories are theories about the mechanism by which learning takes place. And the theory says, here is a characterization of how learning works, and it's different in different types of children, and teachers ought to act on those differences and teach children differently according to the precepts of the theory. And what I'm arguing is there's no evidence to support any of the existing theories. Now, the fact that teachers shouldn't differentiate instruction based on learning style theories doesn't mean that teachers should never differentiate instruction in any way. I'm just arguing that these theories are wrong and this is not a good way to differentiate instruction.
So sometimes you see learning styles parlayed into this idea of personality typing. Actually, two different things. One is the learning style is this is the way that I should approach you as a learner. The other idea is that this is your personality, and because this is your personality, I'll approach you this way as the learner. But they're actually two very different things. In fact, I think that some of you have probably taken some of these personality tests. There's the Myers-Briggs talking about 16 different types of personalities. Type A and Type B, Meyer-Friedman and Ray Rosenman. The Big Five personality: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And then the Holland codes. And the Holland codes is probably the one that you're most familiar with. We use them extensively in current technical education. You've probably taken it at some point. In fact, in Utah, they are presented as early as the 7th grade. And this is where you answer several survey questions like you do with the rest. And based on how you answer, you get a score for realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, or conventional. And that is based on how you kind of sort out in terms of those interests. You start looking then at careers where you could express yourself with your personality in that type of career. Now, the Holland Code has a critic, and it's Tinsley, and he puts out this idea that there's a congruency problem with Holland's theory for vocational decisions. In other words, he doesn't think that these ideas, these areas of personality, realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, conventional, tie in with the sort of things that makes up job satisfaction. And so he sees that as a congruency thing between the personalities. In addition to that, a couple of other folks have said, depending on when you take this particular survey, 7th grade, 9th grade, end of high school, in college, or whatever age you might be, you may actually score quite differently. And in fact, then it's not that reliable. It's not that your personality may actually change based on at least the survey items that are here, and that you might score these things a little bit different based upon what we're talking about in this chapter, your experience. So learning styles, personality typing, learning models, and then of course learning theory. These are all different things, and they're all folks trying to figure out how it is that we learn, how can we incorporate more learning, and you just need to keep coming back to the very basic things. And I think experiential learning is one of those very basic things, especially for adult learners. All right, we've also talked about other and they mention it in this chapter too, models and models and more models. But this is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And of course, this was misconstrued, like Kolb to some degree, into these ideas of learning styles. But all he was saying here, and we had a video previously on this, all he was saying here is that people are smart in different ways. And an IQ test is only measuring one type of way that a person might be smart or intelligent. And so the idea that they have these strengths in these areas, yes, but does that mean that we always approach them with a particular type of style to get them to learn more? Not necessarily, as we've viewed or learned about. So here's Kolb's concrete, abstract, reflective, active experimentation, and maybe you choose to disagree with me, but I don't really see it as a cycle. I don't really see it as a theory for learning. Yes, maybe it's experiential. It's some things that are reflective. Maybe these are all pieces that are experiential. That could work for me, but to see it as a cycle and to parlay that into learning styles doesn't really work. This is more back on the multiple intelligence ideas: body smart, people smart, word smart, nature smart, self smart, picture smart, music smart, and then of course the approaches that you would consider using with that individual. But that doesn't, if they're musically smart or word smart or logic smart, it doesn't mean that they that they can't learn that content in some other way. And like Dr. Willingham said, the best way is to differentiate your instruction. Again, there's this learning styles of learning. There's the Holland codes, conventional, realistic, investigative, and so forth. We talked about that. And then there are assessments where whether you're left brain or right brain, at some point you got to say, what's the point? At some point you got to say, how many more models can there be? I think, again, going back to the core, having experiences and making meaning, those are the kinds of things that you want to try and do through a variety of instructional strategies for learners. And so if we can go here to the sum up here, contextual teaching and learning strategies, here are a few ideas. Emphasize problem solving whenever possible. And that means not just a physical problem, but sometimes an abstract problem. And sometimes if it's a physical problem that you're working on, take that particular construct and make it somewhat abstract. Problem solving is a good place to start. And that starts with that application part of the Bloom's taxonomy. Recognize the need for teaching and learning to occur in a variety of contexts. And sometimes it's going to be in the classroom, sometimes it's going to be outside, sometimes it's going to be maybe in a home setting, wherever it might be. Community work sites, put it in different contexts, and also then check to see if the content is transferred. What they learned, let me back that up just a little bit. So let's say, for example, that if you were laying out a building and you were looking at the Pythagorean theorem, and you understand that that's a way that you're going to square up a building, you want to be explicit about what it is that you're doing. That's a math concept, but it can be applied to squaring up multiple things, such as framing inside of a house. It's the application or the ability to transfer that knowledge. And so putting it in a variety of contexts is really important. Teach students to monitor and direct their own learning so they become self-regulated learners. Now, this idea of teaching students to monitor, I think this was taken from the Department of Education. That's putting teachers in that particular role with adolescents or children. But in an adult context, I would say model, and in fact, even in all contexts, I would say model self-directed learning. I talk about myself oftentimes, preparing these lectures. I'll just go down, keep clicking, making all these associations in my mind, just like this, going from one concept to the other, bing, bing, bing. Hypertext, man, it's it's dangerous, but it also, I engage in self-directed learning in that way. I need to be a little bit more self-regulating sometimes to save time, but that is the important part of one of the main concepts that we want to have here for experiential learning, and a strategy for doing that. Model that for students. Anchor teaching in students' diverse life contexts. So put that in the different way that they are as a learner, whether it be formal, non-formal, or informal. Anchor that in the diverse context that they are going to be within for that, especially on a particular concept. Encourage students to learn from each other and together. This is that collaborative piece. This is the part where we talk about is Google making us dumb? We can get to a lot of that factual, that knowledge at the bottom that we looked at on Bloom's, where we can bring it back and we can get to that understanding part too. But sometimes that application and moving on to the analysis where we break it into pieces, that's not something that Google's going to help us do. So I think if we start thinking about that way, that students can learn those facts by starting right at the application and right at the problem and emphasize problem solving, whether it's adolescents or adults, we're probably going to get a lot further in terms of understanding. In fact, they're going to be, I think, more engaged in the class if the problem is of higher order and that they have to solve that. To solve that problem, they need to have those basic understandings. Employ authentic assessments. That is the subject of an entire course here in your graduate program, but definitely looking at ways to authentically assess something, especially if it's something that's experiential, and that's important. All right, teaching and learning then. Final slide, the sum up for this chapter. Forget about learning styles. I know that I've already said that before, but I actually have a link here that I was Googling learning styles and ran across this individual, Annie Murphy Paul's blog. And forget about learning styles. Here's something better. Of course, that caught my attention, and I went down that rabbit hole of clicking. But as I read through this, it was basically saying what Dr. Willingham said about there not being any good research, and it doesn't make really a lot of sense if you think about it with the particular examples. Of course, we all want to believe it, and so we say, yes, this really exists. I prefer to do things with very physical, hands-on kinds of things. And in some cases, we live in the physical world. That's actually makes more sense to us. That experience makes more sense to us because it is a physical property, and it might be the best way to learn that. In fact, that cognitive scientist he's talked about here. But if you scroll down to get cut to the chase, the lesson's here. The lesson here is that learning style that the teacher and parents should know should focus on the universal learning style of the human mind, and two characteristics of it in particular. First, students benefit from encountering information in multiple forms. So lots of different ways. Touch as many senses as possible. And second, student interest is kept alive by novelty and variety. So regularly turning away from textbooks and blackboards is key. Engaging them in things that are further up on that, where they have to apply some of that basic knowledge or things that they say they understand, or that they looks like they understand because they can take a test, but then you actually have them do the performance and you're like, wow, you were really great at explaining what that was, but you really can't do it. Making sure that you modulate that and you keep that novelty of learning alive by using multiple modalities. One of the reasons also in this course, I have you do kind of different experiences. Truly, they're all online and you haven't done them all yet, but creating modules, creating experience, you having experience, some of you had a frustrating experience, or you're going to be doing like concept webs, creating as many experiences and touching as many senses as possible is really what's going to be meaningful. And it'll have, remember those little dots in the brain that I had up on that previous slide? Well, there'll be even more dots that they can connect that learning to, more experiences that they can connect to. So forget about learning styles. Use teaching strategies that make the content meaningful. Look at that content. And again, is the assessment going to be a performance, or is that assessment going to be just simply communicating that in terms of writing and some sort of reflection? And if they're going to need to do performance, you probably have to approach the learning with a hands-on type of experience. So make the content meaningful based on what it is and put it within context of where that might happen. That means make it authentic. Again, project-based learning, that's psychomotor, that's active, that's hands-on learning. And within project-based learning, we often find problem-based learning, and that's where we're using the mindful part or the cognitive part of those domains. Remember, we're talking about psychomotor, cognitive, and then affective domains, which is the emotional learning. And oftentimes we can do that by simulations or bring about experiences that are engaging and transformational, and make some sort of an emotional connection to a prior experience. I think all of us probably have been listening to that piece of music and brought us back to a different experience. And I also show a video of a transformational experience that I had. So these are the three main domains of learning, and all of the learning theories have an active piece in each one of these, and especially inside of experiential learning, which is constructivist type of learning. I think that project-based learning, problem-based learning, some simulations and games are really good ways or teaching strategies for approaches to learning. Apply reflective practice to all strategies. Now, Kolbe and his model had that. He had reflective practice, but I think it should be applied everywhere. Reflection on action and reflection in action is talked about in your text. One's basically while I'm doing it, I'm reflecting it, what am I doing? And that's being mindful. And reflecting on is in the past. What did I do that I'm going to do different next time? So I think that having that inside of all types of strategies is a really important piece. Use experiential learning within context, touching as many senses as appropriate for understanding and transferring of that understanding. So again, making meaning, touching as many senses as possible in the brain, connecting as many dots to that prior learning or that prior experience. The ability to facilitate learning with the appropriate educative, that's a Dewey word, experience demonstrates the skill of a master teacher. Your ability to grab the right teaching strategy tool to facilitate learning that's appropriate will then create that meaning for that student to truly understand, to apply, and to evaluate and hopefully create their own knowledge. So this slide right here is kind of a wrap-up of how I feel about experiential learning and adult education in general, and probably education for connecting to all experiential learning. Forget about the styles. Work on the basics here of psychomotor, cognitive, and affective domains for learning. These are the three important things. Pick the best practice that will meet that. Be reflective, and it talks about that in your chapter. Apply reflective practices to all of these strategies, regardless of what they are. And it could be reflective in terms of a formative assessment, a summative assessment, and that summative assessment or formative may be a performance of some sort, but reflect on it. And then within that context, touch as many senses as possible. So that's my overview of chapter 6. I hope that it's meaningful to you, and that as you reflect upon this, that you have a deeper understanding about how experience relates to learning.